side, on the other side is sample preparation in food and beverage analysis. And the program as such of today's webinar consists of the following points. So we will have a short introduction, and then we will move through this checklist. So we will talk about what we do when we don't do sample preparation, what we do with a manual sample preparation, how we remove proteins, how we handle workflows and why workflows and established sample preparation procedures are helpful, will be the next point, followed by automation and a short summary. Now let's jump right into the introduction. And the introduction, I brought this slide with me, this picture, if you so want, this graph, because it shows that usually when we do analytical determinations and talk about errors, analytical errors, what we do is we talk about the contribution of the analytical determination. We forget that there are other, even bigger contributors to the analytical error, like sample preparation. So what we will do is we will talk about analytical determination and sample preparation, and focus today on sample preparation as the second big contributor to the analytical error in the analytical determination of carbohydrates.
So Detlef, I understood right? We take part of the right part on that picture.
That's correct, Daniel. We will talk about the sample preparation and the analytical determination, because those two we handle in the laboratory and we have it under control, or we hope so, that we have it under control. Whereas sampling is just a completely different game, different piece of cake. The different people, they have different education, very dedicated to sampling, because you see that if you do an error, a mistake in taking the sample, it does impair basically the entire analytical flow path and the analytical result, if you so want. So
it's a huge impact. Yeah.
It is huge. But as laboratory chemists that we are, analytical chemists that we are, let's focus on the contribution of sample preparation. Now, when we talked about the content of this sample preparation, I thought that sample preparation is a series of decisions. And whenever I have the impression of a series of decisions, I have a Pavlovian reflex that is to create a flow chart. And I did create a flow chart this time as well. And so please don't dive into the flow chart. Don't read all the bullet points, not necessary, because all I wanted to show you with this flow diagram is that you have to do decisions. So, for example, if you get a sample in after sampling, you have to decide whether you want to do sample preparation, yes, or no sample preparation. But don't get fooled. Even if you say, no, I don't do sample preparation, there is a price to pay. Because why do we do sample preparation? We do sample preparation to simplify the matrix, to get improved analytical data, and to protect the consumables, the columns, for example, to not to exchange them too often. And then on the other side, if you say no, what you do also say is, yes, you do save the amount of time and effort that you have to spend for sample treatment, but you pay a price, maybe in terms of precision of the analytical method, maybe in terms of the lifetime of the consumables. So there are decisions to make, and these decisions have consequences in the daily operation. And what we are going to do is we will talk about these decisions and the consequences in the following part of the presentation. Now, when we talk about sample preparation, we need to understand what our enemies are. You know, what kind of contaminants do we face very often in food and beverage analysis? And if we ask that question, then very simply speaking, we end up with three culprits: fats, proteins, and high ionic strength. In other words, salts. Salts can have an impact on the retention time, for example. So if you have a high ionic strength sample, the retention times might be shorter than in a low ionic strength sample. So you might see differences. And what do we do to cope with this question? Well, fat, proteins, and high ionic strength, and those are the major bullets that we are going to cover in this presentation. So let's start right away and look at the next bullet point, and that is no sample preparation. You remember the first decision in the flow path was sample preparation, no sample preparation. So we say we don't do sample preparation. This has a consequence. What consequence does it have? Well, we'll have to look into the effects that no sample preparation has on our stationary phase, our column. Now, if you decide you have your sample in a liquid state, you've dissolved it, and you want to inject it, and you don't do sample preparation, and you expect a matrix effect from your sample, then this little fellow here, the guard column, becomes your best friend. And the guard column has it in its name, guard, to protect. And what does a guard column protect? It protects the separator column. So anything that comes in with a sample that might harm the separator column sticks on the guard column first. The question that we have to answer now is, how do we find out when to either rinse or exchange the guard column? Because it is clear that if you knowingly foul the guard column, you will have to live with decreasing retention times. Now, retention times is the key word. If you look at the setup in front of you, we have a guard column, we have a separator column. Our guard columns usually are 5 centimeters, our separator column 20 centimeters. The total path length of the analytical separation is 25 centimeters. And out of these 25 centimeters, 5 centimeter represents 20% of contribution to the retention time. Now, what you do in your sequence, no matter whether you run isocratic or gradient separations, you always should have one standard available, and just take one of the calibration standards that you have anyways and apply an isocratic separation. Take one of the late eluting peaks from this standard and follow its retention time. Now, if you do that, if you follow the retention time and plot the retention time against an ongoing number, that could be the number of injections, the number of working days, the volume of your eluent, anything that continues and that you can easily measure, and you plot the retention time versus that ongoing number, you do see that the numbers are decreasing. And the limit where you have to take action is when the retention time decreased by 15 to 20%. I lean more towards 15%. Other people lean more to 18, 90%. That's depending on your nerves. So, and you can basically predict when you have to do something with the guard column exchange or rinse. Now, this is a theoretical approach. Let's have a look at real data. So this is from an experiment that we ran in our house, and every single dot represents kind of one sequence. And you do see that we have a continuous decrease in the retention time, and you do see the crosshair, the red crosshair in the plot. That is the latest point when to act. So when to do something with the guard column, to rinse or to exchange.
Detlef, I really like what you mentioned previously, that we actually can predict the remaining lifetime of the guard column by looking at this steady drop in
the
retention
remaining
times.
capacity. Yeah.
The remaining capacity. But in a previous session, you spoke about the carbonate contamination of the eluent. And wouldn't that affect the retention time as well? And if
True.
so, can
True.
we differentiate that?
Oh, that's that's a very good question. Why is that question so good? It is true that if you have a carbonate contamination of your eluent, your retention times will decrease. Now, it takes only a couple of minutes until an eluent is contaminated with carbonate. So you will see a sudden decrease of the retention time in your plot. What you also will see is the moment you use freshly prepared eluent, the retention time comes back to what it was before. So it is a sudden decrease and a sudden increase to what it was before. And that is a kind of differentiator, if you so want, between the continuous pounding of the guard column and the sudden effect of an carbonate contaminated eluent. Very good one. Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is what you can do with your guard column in terms of a situation where you don't want to do a sample preparation. Now let's have a look into manual sample preparation. And what is the best sample preparation? No sample preparation. We just talked about that because there's always a consequence of your decision. We just talked about the guard column, lifetime of the guard column, and rinsing and so on. But what about manual sample preparation? What do we usually mean by manual sample preparation? The first thing that comes into mind is dilution. Dilution to address the high ionic strength situation we talked at the beginning, where we have high concentrations of salts. Now, why is that of interest? It's of interest because salts, say sulfate or chloride, which you can't see in the amperometric detector, will have an impact on the retention time. So if you ever find yourself in a situation that one sample shows a significantly shorter retention time than the next sample, it is likely that in the sample showing the lower retention times, a higher concentration of inorganic salts might be, or organic acids might be present, and you don't see them. Now, the first thing that you can do is to dilute your sample. If you dilute your sample, you do lower the analyte concentration. That is correct. But you also impair or impact the limit of detection for that particular sample because you are using a stronger dilution of your sample. Now, does that mean that we have any issues with dilution? No. If you look to the next bullet point, that's something that I learned during my career, very early on in my career. Then whenever unknown samples come in, a very wise man told me to dilute the sample 100-fold, then inject and see what the outcome is, because that chromatogram would tell me which steps to take. Now, in carbohydrate analysis, in HPAEC-PAD, pulse amperometric detection, we have plenty of sensitivity. We have a highly sensitive detection scheme that allows us to not only dilute the sample significantly, but also use smaller injection volumes to address situations in which we have an impact of ionic strength on the retention times. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there might be situations where you can't solve the issue of an high ionic strength sample by just simply diluting. In this situation, you might turn towards offline SPE cartridges, So SPE, solid phase extraction cartridges, which, just as an hint, a little advice, should be made out of polymeric material, polystyrene divinyl benzene based resins. And these resins come in different forms because you can tailor the selectivity in a way that you are specifically removing certain components out of the sample. So for example, that you could have cation exchangers, polymeric cation exchangers in these cartridges filled with an acidic cation exchanger. What you do is you remove cations and acidify the sample without the addition, by the way, of any chemical to the sample. You just treat it with the resin. Like the next one, the cation exchanger in the silver form. You remove chloride, you remove sulfide, thiosulfide, and anything that would form silver precipitates or silver complexes. Or let's take the next one, that is the cation exchange in the barium form, where you can remove sulfate, or you have an anion exchange cartridge to remove anions from the sample. So again, no matter what you do, make sure, number one, that these cartridges are made out of polymer. Number two, little piece of advice, or a little piece of, how should I say, a practical approach. When do I use these offline cartridges? Well, honestly speaking, only when I have to, because each of the cartridges do cost money, and you have to buy them for that purpose. You have to keep a stock for them of them if you are using them. So only when needed. And yeah.
What can we do if I am as a user have a need of a specific recommendation?
Oh, very simple. Contact us.
No, that's pretty simple.
Just give us a call. I mean, you have my email address on the slide. You can have my telephone number, like Daniel's and any other colleague of Antec Scientific. Just give us a call. Let us know your analytical need, your sample preparation need, and we will direct you towards the right cartridge to be used.
That's as easy as it can be.
It's not. It's the easiest way. Just give us a chance. Just ask us. So that was manual sample preparation, cartridges, and now the big enemy number one in carbohydrate analysis of food and beverage samples: proteins. For an analytical chemist, what is a protein? A protein is a long chain of amino acids. So we have anion exchange properties, we have cation exchange properties, and people who know me well know that I call proteins the krakens of ion exchange, because they have multiple points of interaction, and once a protein is on an anion exchanger, well, you can easily get it on, but getting it off, that is a real task. So in order to avoid you being confronted with that protein washing out of the stationary phase, let's remove it up front. And during the presentation's preparation phase, I thought maybe it might be an idea to list the typical approaches for protein removal that you find in food and beverage analysis, and I came up with a little table which I should show you on the next slide. And the different approaches are listed in the table, are kind of the frequency you find that of reflecting the frequency you find these sample preparations in the food and beverage arena. And number one, removal of proteins is carré. Carré is if you so want, a metal-induced protein precipitation. You add two salts, two inorganic salts, like potassium hexacyanoferrate, that's carré 1, and carré 2 is zinc sulfate. We will have to talk about the sulfate from the zinc sulfate, but that will be in the next slide. So what you do is you add these two solutions to your sample. The protein precipitates and you filter off. The interesting thing is that while you are precipitating the protein, also fat out is being removed. So it's basically a co-precipitation of the fat. So two birds with one stone. Then the next one is methanol. You 60% methanol to precipitate the protein, the protein from your dairy products, for example, and that is an easy approach to get rid of the proteins. Clear solutions are the result, and then we have trichloroacid.
Sorry to interrupt that, Lev. So this organic solvent you mentioned, methanol. This is the alcohol methanol, and carbohydrates are polyalcohols.
Correct.
And so can methanol interfere with the detection?
Can methanol interfere with the detection? The answer is yes, because methanol is an alcohol and carbohydrates are polyalcohols, as you rightly pointed out. And does it interfere with the analytical determination of carbohydrates? No. Why? Because methanol, as a very small molecule in comparison to the carbohydrates, elutes very early in the beginning of the chromatogram, close to the void volume of the analytical separation. So there is hardly any influence. But let me continue with asking that question. You asked the first question about methanol. Why on earth do we use methanol? I mean, why don't we use another organic solvent? That has to do with the solubility of carbohydrates in alcohols. So the solubility of carbohydrates in methanol compared to ethanol and higher alcohols is highest. So we can precipitate the protein and can still keep the carbohydrate in solution. So the yield for the target analytes that we have in mind, it's highest with the methanol treatment. So trichloroacetic acid, that's not much to say, they're very standard. And then we have ultrafiltration and ultracentrifugation. And I have to admit, I am a big fan of ultrafiltration, and that's why we are going to talk a little bit about ultrafiltration on one of the next slides. Now, whatever you do, you have to keep an eye on the consequences. And as I said, there is a consequence when you use zinc sulfate for Carré. Let us have a closer look to the consequences. So Carré solutions, as I said, Carré 1 is potassium hexacyanoferrate, Carré 2 is zinc sulfate. Now the trouble with sulfate is that under the conditions of carbohydrate separation, sulfate is a divalent anion. And as a divalent anion, it has a strong interaction with the stationary phase. So if you inject zinc sulfate, it could happen, depending on the analytical conditions, of course, but it could happen that all of a sudden the retention times of this sample that we are looking at is shorter than with the standard. Now, if that is the case, then the remedy might be to substitute zinc sulfate with zinc acetate. The acetate, you remember, is one of the elements we use in carbohydrate separation, and therefore has a lower interaction with the stationary phase, which means that the impact on the retention time will be lower. So that is the reason why the suggestion is to substitute zinc sulfate with zinc acetate. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it might be that you find yourself in a situation that you cannot change zinc sulfate to zinc acetate because you have an SOP, because you're working in a regulated environment. There might be several reasons for that. So are you lost now? Are you screwed, or can we do something? Let me show you that you are not lost. Again, this is a flow chart. It is describing a Carré precipitation, and I don't want you to read all the details. I only want to show you one thing. So the colleagues who prepared this analytical sample preparation workflow, in the last but one step, they are conditioning an anion exchange SPE cartridge and remove the anions, so hexacyanoferrate and the sulfate, out of the sample. And all of a sudden, the retention times will be matching the retention times of your non-salty standards. So a very clever way to get rid of the anionic contamination due to the sulfate from the zinc sulfate. So
Detlef, that's really great to learn about this and also the effect of the sulfate and the alternative, the zinc acetate.
yeah,
I've spoken with customers who reported exactly the same behavior that you described, a retention time shift between standards and the samples. And I believe the reason to be the sample matrix, but maybe it was just the sample prep.
yeah, with the sample prep where we are adding anions, we are basically changing the matrix of the sample to be analyzed. That is one of the reasons why I prefer sample preparation techniques without adding components to the sample, because then we are circumventing these sad issues. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that the approaches that are presented for the protein removal are the only ones. There are plenty. Acid denaturation, heating, like cooking milk for your children and then don't pay attention. If you overheat the milk, boom, the milk proteins are deprotonating, and at least my kids didn't want to drink the milk afterwards. So then we have trichloroacidic precipitation, acetone precipitation. Then we have a precipitation using chloroform and methanol. We'll come back to that because I like that. And the ammonium sulfate precipitation. Now, why do I like the chloroform methanol precipitation? If you add chloroform and methanol to your aqueous sample, you will see the formation of two phases, an organic layer and an aqueous layer, and the proteins are being denaturated at the point where both layers meet. So you have a deprotonation without the addition of an agent, a reagent into your sample, and you can separate the aqueous from the organic layer, and then can continue with the determination of carbohydrates. You would precipitate, you would spin off, you would ultracentrifuge or filter, and then you will continue. So that's the reason why I like the chloroform methanol precipitation a lot. But I promised you to come back to the ultrafiltration. And why is that? Because ultrafiltration is of the same kind. It addresses my laziness, if you so want, because all you do is you purchase these ultrafiltration vials from different vendors. It usually consists of an Eppendorf type vial and an insert. And this insert, this one here, comes with filters, and these filters have different pore sizes, therefore different molecular weight cutoffs. And you decide by the choice of this molecular weight cutoff, what's the size of the component that I allow to pass through into the filtrate, and which is the size of the components that are being retained. Now, all you do is you put your sample into that inlay, you combine these two vials as one, you put it into your centrifuge, and you spin off. And all you do is you remove the inlay, the insert, and you can practically use the filtrate right away. Dilute and shoot.
How cool is that, Detlef? There's almost no manual work involved.
That's true. That's true. That's almost no manual work involved. The matter of fact is, whatever decision we do in life, including the decisions in sample preparation, there are consequences. We just talked about how easy it is, how cool it is, how little work is involved. So what's on the other side of the coin? On the other side of the coin is the cost of these ultrafiltration devices. So you will have to look into how many samples you have to analyze and whether or not this ultrafiltration is a cost-effective way of preparing your samples, or if you decide to go for a different approach. And guess what? This is one of the reasons why the Carré clarification is so popular in many market segments, including the food and beverage arena, because it is quite cost effective. You have two inexpensive solution, you pipette, pop, and filter, precipitate, spin off or filter off, and off you go. So what we wanted to do is, ladies and gentlemen, to give you an overview of what possibilities you have to get rid of the proteins, because proteins are enemy number one, I think, in food and beverage arena. I would say between 75 and 85, maybe even 90% of all the samples we analyze in the food and beverage arena are dealing with proteins. So we stay in the context of sample preparation, and what's next on the checklist, that is workflows. Workflows. Why do I talk about workflows? Again, this is a workflow describing a sample preparation. I don't want you to read all the fine prints, because it is a busy slide. So it's very difficult to read. I know that. But what I wanted to do with this flowchart is to remind us that it is a pretty clever move to, whenever you are dealing with unknown samples, to on the lookout for sample preparation techniques already developed, like the application notes that we publish, coming with very detailed sample preparation approaches. So use them. Why is that clever? Because colleagues have already spent quite some time to create a detailed approach for sample preparation. So in this case here, you will cut the chewing gum with about sucralose determination chewing gum. You will cut the chewing gum in small pieces. You extract over a longer period of time. You centrifuge, you filter, you dilute and inject. And why am I suggesting to be on the lookout for existing sample preparation techniques? It allows you to generate data that are comparable, and that is one of the goals of the sample preparation techniques, to allow comparable data generation. Now, sucralose and fish in mint gum, and I'm not sure whether you ever had the pleasure of analyzing whatever in chewing gum. One thing is for sure, that is a very sticky analysis. So it's no fun to really analyze carbohydrates and artificial sweeteners, for example, in chewing gum. Now, a similar matrix, similar complex matrix, is basically processed meat dishes, be it beef, pork, or fish. If they are marinated and you are interested in the marinated and the carbohydrates and the marinade, so what you do is you have to do a sample preparation. So, and how do you do that? It's a complex series of steps that you have to do, and luckily our colleagues in our R&D and application development department already did that for you. So it's a clever way to follow these steps. And by the way, not sure whether you can see that, a Claret filtration, a Claret clarification, Claret 1, Claret 2 is involved in here as well. And as well as dilution, centrifugation, and again filtration at the end of the sample preparation technique before it goes into the carbohydrate analyzer. And the good part of sample preparation is that you're simplifying the matrix so that you can achieve chromatographic separations like the one you see in front of you. See the black chromatogram, that is a real world sample showing you the carbohydrates that were present in the fish dish, and you see how simple the chromatogram looks like, how well the carbohydrates are being separated thanks to the column technology that we have. That is the other secret for these wonderful separations, to choose the right column. Now, there is one matrix that has not really something to do with carbohydrates in food and beverage analysis, but I wanted to reflect on this as well because you'll find it in the media, you will find it in publications. That is the analysis of carbohydrates from biomass. So be it for the production of biofuels, be it for the production of sustainable pharmaceuticals, be it for the production of polymers, for building materials. So biomass has a broad utility, a broad use as a raw material for subsequent industrial productions. Now, if you look at wood, the question is, or at chitins, the crust, if you so want, the shells of crabs, you have to answer the question, how do I access the carbohydrates? I mean, how do I release the carbohydrates? And again, if you look into publications on this topic, there are sample preparation techniques described, like the one you see in front of you, where we use an acidic digest, and the acidic digest is depending on the matrix. So, for example, wood samples are digested with a higher concentration of sulfuric acid than cellulose, for example. And chitin is hydrolyzed with HCl, with hydrochloric acid, rather than with sulfuric acid. So there are reasons for all these different recipes. So my suggestion is to basically look into existing applications and existing articles and take the sample preparation from there, because that will allow you to run or to create comparable data. And you find many of these sample preparations described in a great detail in our application notes. Now, if you do that sample preparation, releasing and simplifying the matrix, then it will allow you to come up with chromatographic separations like the one you see in front of you, where we have the black chromatogram being a standard, or let's say a spiked wood sample, and the red chromatogram being a wood sample. And look at the separation of arabinose, rhamnose, xylose, mannose, in solutions being high on sulfate from the sulfuric acid digest. That's just wonderful. It's just mind-blowing to see how well the separation is done. You have the neutral sugars at the beginning of the chromatogram. In the middle, you have cellobiose as a marker for completeness of the hydrolysis. And then you have the charged carbohydrates, the uronic acids, eluting at the end of the chromatogram.
Detlef, one remark, what is in the middle? What is that mountain? Or maybe, I live close to the Alps, so actually that looks more like a tiny hill. But whatever we call it, what is it? And I think I have seen a similar one in the fish sample.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. And let's have a look at the yellowish bar on top. That is basically showing you the elution of the carbohydrates. First, we start with the low concentrated sodium hydroxide solution, then with a higher concentrated sodium hydroxide solution, which we use as in a step gradient kind of approach. And what the hump is in the first black arrow, that is basically due to the increase of sodium hydroxide in the amperometric cell. That changes the resistivity of the amperometric cell. It changes the current that flows. It changes the background current, and that's what you see is changing. That's why we have that increase in the baseline. It later on stabilizes, but then you have that second peak marked within black arrow. So what is that? It's basically similar thing, maybe even identical. But now the hydroxide is not originated from the eluent, but it is released from the column. Why? At the beginning of the chromatogram, we're using hydroxide-based eluents, no acetate. So the column, the anion exchangers are in the hydroxide form. When I start using acetate as an eluent, at a certain point, when a critical acetate concentration is achieved, is reached, then basically the column changes instantaneously from the hydroxide form into the acetate form, and that releases a higher concentration of hydroxide into the amperometric cell. And then the same thing happens, but because that is a sudden effect, very small effect compared to the eluent contribution, that peak is narrow and very sharp. So that would be the explanation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, cool.
Sure.
Now, let's talk about the next bullet point, that is automation. And there is one sample preparation technique that we have not yet touched in great detail, that is filtration. So the question is, can we automate filtration as well? So the answer is yes. And if you automate filtration, then you use a high pressure inline filter as an additional accessory in front of the guard column. And as you can see in the lower right corner of the slide, there are different forms in which these high pressure inline filters come. You know, some have these little filter discs that can be exchanged. Some are filters that are exchanged in total. And this one here, despite it looks as if it would be metal, it is just a metal casing, but everything else that is inside is made out of PEEK, can withstand up to 5,000 or 6,000 psi. So these filters come in different brands and different flavors. But whatever you do is driven by the particles. So the particles end up on the filter, and if you follow the background, the back pressure of the instrument, you will see that the back pressure will continuously increase, and the pressure increase that would trigger some activities on the instrument is between 500 and 800 psi. It's depending on the laboratories settings of the laboratories recommendations. So 500 to 800 psi, but it would involve stopping the sequence, exchanging, replacing the filter cartridge or the filter disc, and then restarting the sequence. Now you might say, Detlef, wait a second. I don't want to stop and exchange and restart. And there are things then consequently that I have to do, like recalibration or checking the calibration. Can't I automate these inline filtration steps? And the answer is yes. It's a fantastic combination of a 6-port valve, this one here, that is the injection valve, and the 10-port valve. The 10-port valve holds two cartridges, two filter cartridges, and what you do is you inject your sample onto the first filter, the particles are being retained, and the analytes are being separated and detected. Now, valves can be switched, so we are going to switch in a second the 10-port valve. So now we switched, we have different connections, and we can inject the next sample on a fresh filter. However, once the separation is commencing on the analytical column, we can at the same time start to wash out the particles from the filter, and then we have a fresh filter again that allows us to inject the sample and continue.
Detlef, manual sample preparation filters are usually single use. And here we use the filter multiple times. And is there a risk of cross-contamination also?
Very good question. There is a major difference between manually used filters and these inline filters. These inline filters are constantly in a flow-through situation. They are always rinsed, always being flushed. So the risk of cross-contamination is minimum. I would even go so far to say if everything is being set up correctly, that you have no risk. I saw applications with several hundred, several thousand injections, no cross-contamination whatsoever. But this combination of a 6-port and a 10-port valve is very powerful. It allows you to automate other applications in, for example, food and beverage, in the food and beverage arena. And one of the very popular application is the determination of lactose. So this is the standard, the traditional setup for the lactose determination. So what you do is you take a suitable column like our SweetSap AEX20, you separate the lactose epimers like allolactose, lactose, and epilactose. And after you are ready, you can't just simply go ahead and inject your next sample because there are these oligo and polysaccharides sticking on the column, and you have to wash them out because otherwise your retention times would be collapsing after a number of injections. So you have to wash the column. You have to re-equilibrate the column. And if you look at the time that is needed, that is basically about the same time that we need for the analytical separation of the analytes. That's wasted time. So can we do something about it? 6-port, 10-port valve. Automation. So you see here we have the 6-port valve, here we have the 10-port valve. We have the second pump, like in the filtration case, but instead of filters, we have two analytical column sets. So what we do is we inject our sample on the first column. Lactose epimers are eluted, detected, oligosaccharides, polysaccharides are retained. Then the valve switches and the next sample is being analyzed. And at the same time, the first column is being rinsed and flushed and equilibrated. And you see what happens after the second injection is completed, you switch back again and you can do basically a flip-flop between the two columns. And if we look at the consequence, that is the traditional chromatogram again. Now we cut out the part of the reconditioning out of the analytical channel. We have a separate channel for that, for flushing the column. And while the column is being flushed, the next injection can occur on the second column, and then we do the flip-flop. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, what happens is you double the sample throughput. You increase the sample throughput by 100%.
That's huge.
That is huge, and we achieve that by not only the automation approach, we make things simpler and faster, but we also have a nice stack of modules that saves precious lab space. So we have a number of very good reasons to follow that approach. Now, that was automation. That leaves me just to summarize the presentation. What did we talk about? We did talk about the error contribution of sample preparation to the analytical total error. And we talked about that having it under control is a best way to minimize that contribution. We talked about removing proteins. We talked about the different precipitation approaches. We talked about ultrafiltration. We talked about inline matrix elimination. We talked about SPE. We talked about inline filtration, and we talked about the good of using existing sample preparation techniques published by colleagues, because it saves time and money and allows you to generate comparable data. There was a lot of information, I'm aware of that, but I hope it was interesting. I hope it was funny. So I hope so. And that is the point where I would like to pass the word back to you, Daniel, for questions. Do we have questions?